to discuss integrated weed management, also referred to as IWM. I've got a couple of different references to take a look at. One of them is from Penn State Extension on integrated weed management. Very short, one page, kind of encompasses everything in a concise manner. And then I also referred to this Nebraska Extension pamphlet, which discusses integrated weed management as well. There's a lot of great information out there on integrated weed management. I'm going to cover the basics today, and I think, if you want to dive deeper into it, obviously we can. So, a big difference between integrated weed management and integrated pest management is that prevention becomes part of the picture. In the past, or when we look at the insects, we don't necessarily discuss prevention. Prevention gets lumped into cultural control, and although that's fine, to some degree it's good to look at the preventative measures, and with weeds we can do that a little easier maybe. Although I think you can do it with the insects as well, and I talk about that with IPM. So what is integrated weed management? It's a diversified approach to agricultural weed management that aims to more effectively target problem weeds by incorporating multiple strategies together. IWM allows the producer to design their weed management program around what is the most effective for the particular weeds, crop, and farm operation. So when we look at this illustration here, just like with integrated pest management, we've got 4 different types of control or management strategies. But then the prevention becomes a big piece, like I said. So there's 5 components: prevention, mechanical, cultural, biological, and chemical is always last. And we start with the soft chemicals and work our way to harder chemicals. Okay. And what is the objective of IWM? Well, we just discussed the definition. We want to use multiple strategies. Part of the reason for multiple strategies is as this idea that we are throwing the weeds off track. Keeping them on their toes. And I know that sounds kind of a little nutty because do weeds have brains? Well, they absolutely have the ability to adapt to everything we do. Every management strategy we can think of, weeds have the ability to adapt and change for that so that they can survive, because they're all about survival. They're all about inhabiting disturbed areas, surviving. We've already learned how their seed dormancy can be excessively long, and they have different periods of dormancy in which they can remain until the favorable conditions are there to allow them to regrow again, or grow again, I should say. But the objectives as a grower of IWM is we want to reduce the overall economic impact of weeds, right? We talked on Tuesday about the billions of dollars spent. I think there's recorded, what did I say, 2.5 and then another 3.5. $6+ billion a year that the United States alone spends on weed control. We also want to reduce our herbicide use. There's a lot of negative impacts associated with herbicides, not just our environmental impacts, which are quite lengthy, to be honest, but also our health, you know, as a grower, as a consumer. We want to reduce the impact of herbicide use. And not to mention that herbicides are expensive, so these are connected. You've also got to consider, you know, the equipment, the time, the education that needs to go into spraying. And basically with these two are related, obviously, in a way, when you think about the money piece of herbicides, but then also overall we want to optimize our economic returns. So with that, thinking about increasing the crop production, you know, not allowing the weeds to outcompete the crop. So increasing or optimizing our economic return on the crop, okay? So again, the little piece of it, it's about money to some degree. Obviously, like I said, with reducing herbicides, there's an environmental impact as well, and something that we're learning extensively in our soils class, or at least I think we are, is about how important the microbiology of the soil is. And herbicides impact that biology immensely. You know, glyphosate, for instance, is and has been labeled as an antibiotic. So we're learning how important the bacteria, the positive bacteria of the soil is. Well, if something's an antibiotic, obviously it's going to kill the bacteria. The herbicides are also impacting the, you know, fungal populations of the soil, and so on and so forth. So it's a contradiction when we look at soil building if we are using herbicides. And I mean extensively using herbicides. I prefer not to spray. You, my students, you know I prefer not to. But if we really just took the opportunity to spray when it was absolutely necessary, we wouldn't see the impact that we're seeing on our environment or on the health of our humans, because it seems there's a sincere overuse, and I don't think that's just me seemingly suggesting that. I think there is a lot of data out there that reports the overuse of herbicides, and it has a lot to do with the marketing. That's a whole nother story. The other piece of it is the herbicide-resistant crops. The herbicide-resistant weeds. So we'll talk more about that as well, because weeds, as I mentioned, have the ability to adapt to every management strategy we try. So we have to basically be one step ahead of them, and also we need to realize that they're going to adapt to whatever it is we do. All right, so let's get into the IWM a little bit further and discuss some pieces of this. All right, so general rules of IWM. Let's put here rules. As you might imagine, in the prevention, number one rule is limit the introduction and spread of weeds. Limit introduction and spread. So this is under your prevention. And when it comes to potential management strategies, we want to look at cultural controls or cultural strategies second, and that would be helping the crop compete with the weeds, or let's say out-compete weeds. Okay? And then we also want to use practices to keep weeds off balance that goes back to that, so that they won't adapt. So basically when we're attempting to keep our weeds off balance, we are trying to prevent them from adapting to the management strategies that we're using. So often what will happen is we use a lot of different management strategies, and that goes back to that definition where it says right in here we're incorporating multiple strategies together, and that's key. So these become cultural strategies, or I'm kind of getting away from the word control. I think my students know that. I have a real hard time with that word because we're not in control as much as we might want to think we are. Nature, Mother Nature is ultimately, I don't know, yeah, I would say Mother Nature is ultimately in control. But it's a matter of we are working with a dynamic situation, things are changing, things are alive. We're never going to be completely in control. So there's no silver bullet, there's no single recipe, and the goal really is to, and again, this goes back to my terminology, the goal is really to prevent, but once you have weeds, it's to manage them. And not to eradicate them. And why do I say that? It's not about eradication, because wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't it be great if we could completely eradicate our weeds? And maybe we can. I talk about the farm couple, the Eric and Ann Nordell in Pennsylvania. And we have an article here that we're going to read that Eric wrote. And they have been able to eradicate some of their weeds. I've spoke about them before to the class. This is a couple that's been farming for over 30 years. They use cover crops and a technique that we will cover extensively because I think it's a really smart method that they're using. But basically they've been able to eradicate certain weeds. And over their 30 years, they've started out with the most difficult weeds. They've prioritized them. And now they're basically dealing with much, I would say minor weeds, really. When I visited their farm for a tour, it was in 2012. Yep, no, 13. Pretty sure it was 2013, yes. And we took a farm tour, and I literally counted one dandelion, which was amazing. And I'm pretty sure they've got like 30 acres. I know at 30 years, 30 acres. Maybe I'm making that up, but no, I'm pretty sure it's 30 acres. And they market garden. But the weed that they were dealing with the most was chickweed. So they were dealing with chickweed. Well, that's pretty minor. I mean, chickweed's edible. It's actually medicinal. And if somebody gets a little chickweed mixed in with their kale or their salad greens or their broccoli, well, not a big deal. Really not a big deal. It might even be beneficial. So, because I think I spoke about the medicinal values of chickweed to my class to some degree. And if I didn't, remind me and I will. All right. So getting just a little bit further into prevention, as you can imagine, a big part of prevention is sanitation, right? So that has to do with this idea that you're not not introducing the seeds in the first place, or the weeds in the first place. So field sanitation would fall under this. And that's kind of a weird word, sanitation. We're talking about soil, and we're talking about crops. We're out in the field. I mean, I don't know that I want it to be completely sanitary, right? Especially in these times when we're using hand sanitizer like it's, water. I'm not sure I want that, because again, that's going to go back to, well, that's a whole other story. Anyway, this is a different thought where we're trying to prevent the weeds from entering the field And once they get there, we're trying to prevent them from spreading. Goes back to that. All right, so ways you can do that. We're going to get into the Nordell's approach with the cover crops. So crop cover is actually just, now that's different from cover crop, because crop cover means that you are trying to cover the field as much as possible with living cash crops, preferably, but if it's not a cash crop, it'd be a cover crop, in which case cover crops can be cash crops. But another way is to buy certified weed-free seed. And that exists. You want to buy from reputable growers. You want to buy from people who are and maybe have been in business for some time. You know, that's a good policy, because if they've been in business for some time, they're probably doing right by their customers. Learning about their practices and their philosophy would be a good thing. But weed-free seed, certified weed-free seed exists. You want to get seed with a high germination rate. Usually when we are purchasing seed, there's a percent germination rate, okay? And that percent germination rate by law cannot be below a certain threshold. That threshold varies depending on your crop, but basically the idea there is that when you have a high germination rate, your plants are going to have good crop cover, right? So you want to look for something in the 90%. Ideally, 80% is not horrible. The high 80s obviously would be more preferable. Once you get into that 70% range, I would buy somewhere else. So you want to look at a high germination rate. You want to look for quality seed. Again, this is going to be knowing your buyer, knowing your grower, or at least identifying what their practices are and their ratings, essentially. Let's say you are planting seedlings as opposed to seeds. So you want to look for vigorous seedlings. You want to purchase high quality vigorous seedlings or grow your own, okay? And so I'm just going to say vigorous seedlings. And sorry to jump back into this high germination rate, but when you have a high germination rate, you're going to have quick cover and full cover, and you're also going to have uniform crop emergence. Okay. All right. So controlling the, or limiting introduction and controlling the spread, we also would look at controlling volunteer weeds. So that's where you would go along the edges of your field, your fence line, ditches, those kinds of areas, string trim them before they go to seed. You want to clean your equipment. And that's, from field to field, or if somebody else borrowed your equipment, ask them to clean it afterwards. If you have to travel somewhere with your equipment. So those types of practices. You want to tarp your grain truck. Well, because if your grain truck is rolling down the highway, it could blow off seed into the neighbor's yard. And even though corn might not be a weed, if you're trying to grow something that's not corn, say soybeans or broccoli or whatever, then the corn does become a weed, right? So we've already talked about weeds being a subjective term. It's up to you if it's a weed or not. A story I usually tell at this moment is about a farmer. His name's Percy. and he's a famous farmer in the Monsanto lawsuits. He's one of the first I learned about when I started learning about GMOs, and I didn't really understand all of the pieces to it, so this was the first piece I learned about. And this fellow Percy had been farming for 35 plus years. His crop was canola. That's right, his crop was canola, and he had collected his own canola seed year after year after year after year. So he had created his own, essentially he had created his own, what would you call it? His own variety, essentially, that was adapted to his land. And there's a lot of value in that, not only in just the act of doing it, but in the fact that you've got now a crop that's adapted to your land. It's not just adapted to the Pacific Northwest or the Northeast, it's adapted to your GPS location. That's huge. And there was a truck that drove by at one point and did not have proper tarping, and they were growing canola as well. And the canola flew out of the truck and landed in his fence rows. So Percy wasn't organic. He sprayed herbicides all along his fence rows and along his telephone poles, and areas that he couldn't get to cultivate or to cut down. And one day he realized that the canola that he was spraying near the telephone line was not dying. He was spraying Roundup and it would not die. So he had accidentally, or he didn't do it at all, actually, the grain truck had not taken this precaution, and this weed essentially now landed in his canola area. So then what happens? His canola is cross-pollinating with the genetically modified canola. Now this canola that fell off the grain truck was genetically modified to resist Roundup, right? We're all familiar with those by now. And basically, one of the saddest stories I ever heard, frankly, he was sued by Monsanto and they won. Monsanto won. So Percy not only lost the lawsuit, but he lost this grain, or this, seed that he had been cultivating for over 35 years. And they literally took his seed away. I'm not sure what they did. I want to say it was burnt. It was destroyed. We could say that. It was definitely destroyed. We could definitely say that. But yeah, sad interview. If you ever want to look that up, I mean, not that I want to bring you down, but it's raining. It's already enough. But although we need the rain. But at any rate, his wife could barely talk because she cried the entire interview because of the fact that they lost their livelihood. And lost their livelihood because of somebody else's negligence. And here's the other piece of that. If you've got cattle and you don't fence your cattle in and they show up at your neighbor's house and destroy your neighbor's crops, you're probably going to get in trouble, right? So why is it that this grain truck was negligent and seed fell on Percy's land, but yet Percy gets... Okay, so other ways you can look at prevention is when you introduce manures. So make sure you're introducing clean manure as best you can. I've already had this conversation, but if the manure is aged, it will often have less weed seed or less viable weed seed. Again, not just manure, but your compost. Make sure your compost is aged. And often there's a time frame in which this aged process can happen, and it will reduce seed viability if the seed is passing through the animal. And I've talked about this because I mentioned how I had this, I probably will still use it, to be honest. I mean, I hate to say it in a way, but I don't, because it's really good, alive, beautiful manure. But it often brings in whole new weeds, a whole new set of weeds to my life. But in some cases, it's worth it because of the liveliness of the weeds themselves. I'm sorry, the compost itself. So the other part would be to control new invaders and the herbicide-resistant weeds before they spread. So the herbicide-resistant weeds, we'll probably look at a video on that. There's a lot out there about herbicide-resistant weeds because basically what's happened is these weeds have become adapted to the chemicals and now they're considered super weeds. And if you thought regular weeds were bad, super weeds are super bad. So that's definitely a problem. But in general, prevention is the least expensive, the best return on your time spent, and the most overlooked. Everybody's got something else to do. I'm not making time for that because it doesn't look like a priority right now. But yet, if you make the prevention piece a priority, the rest of it becomes a lot easier. All right. So, let's look at cultural controls. And with your cultural controls, number one is to help your weeds. We don't want to help our weeds really. It is to help our crops outcompete the weeds. So, ways that you can do that. Cultural practices, and this objective is to help crop outcompete weeds. Okay? So the way we can do that, a couple of ways. Fertilizer placement. A couple of different ways you can fertilize your fields. One way is to broadcast the fertilizer. That's going to fertilize everything that's possibly growing. The other way you could do it is to get your fertilizer as close to the crop as possible. And sometimes that's considered banding your crop. But the objective is close to crop as possible. And I think you can imagine why that is, because if you're broadcasting fertilizer, then you're fertilizing your weeds as well as your crop, and that competition remains high. You can adjust your row spacing. And there are some studies out there. I think it's on, if I remember right, soybeans. Yeah, soy. Basically, if you place, this is just an example, your soybeans 7 to 15 inches apart, they are more competitive, and in some cases the recommendation would be 38 inches apart, which seems like a lot, but at any rate, having this closer row spacing is, you don't want to obviously get too close because you want your plants to be able to have enough room for their own production, your crops to have enough room, but the idea is to have that full coverage to prevent the weed seeds from germinating, because most weeds need light to germinate. And then just an idea of the act of competing. So this closer spacing is more competitive. You might look at certain crop varieties that are more competitive than others. And one example is that a taller wheat and a taller soy, they close that canopy more completely than the shorter varieties. So that's an example. You might look at your planting time. So this would be the idea that the Nordells are looking at with their article, Weed the Soil, Not the Crop. But the idea that you prep your bed first and create that beautiful seed bed, and then you water the seed bed to allow the weed seeds to emerge. and then you might cultivate again before you plant. Another option is to not cultivate, but to flame the newly emerging weeds. So we'll talk a little bit about flaming. Another possible way to help your crop compete against weeds is to use transplants as opposed to seeds. And this can depend on your crop as well. I mean, I think, certain crops have to be planted by seed no matter what, like carrots, for instance. But certain plants or certain crops might do better as transplants. And then the other one is irrigation. So just like with the fertilizer placement, irrigation placement. So a lot of people are using drip systems, and the drip is getting that water directly to the crop. That's not practical in a huge field. That's going to be more practical in your market gardens and in your home gardens, obviously. But using a giant sprinkler or a giant, I don't even know what you call them. I want to call it a boom, but it's not a boom because booms are in the greenhouse. But using that giant cannon type sprinkling system is going to water the weeds just as easy or just as much as it waters the crop. So the idea is to get the water right where the crop is. So in the transplants, another way is that to water your transplants right before planting, and then also they have what's called a water wheel where you water, or I'm sorry, the water wheel is separate, different things, sorry. It's a transplanter that has a mechanism for watering the transplants as soon as they get watered in. Obviously hand watering is not going to be practical for the fields, but can be absolutely practical for a market garden. So just something else there to consider. Another big cultural practice, and we talk about cover crops, but this is the active crop rotation. So another big way to keep weeds off balance is to implement crop rotation. And it might seem a little hard to believe, but it's true that the certain weeds will follow certain crops. And I don't mean like, purslane always jumps on board with corn. What I mean is annual weeds will often be found more often in annual cropping systems, and perennial weeds in perennial systems, which kind of makes sense. But at the same time, if we are crop rotating, we're going to throw the weeds off balance in that way. And there's kind of a, I don't know, maybe there is a recipe out there for crop rotation. If there is, I don't have it in my head, but what I would say is just using a different crop from a different family. Also, alternating your monocots with your dicots, so corn and soy, obviously. But then, even in a more diverse vegetable system, you would want to crop rotate and integrate those cover crops in the mix. One of my favorite cover crops is buckwheat, and the reason I like buckwheat is because it grows very fast. It flowers quickly. The bees love it. That's my other reason. Syrphid flies. Everybody loves it. But it also provides cover in the summer. So like if I have say I have a spring crop of lettuce greens and they all get pulled out on June 15th, well, buckwheat's a really good cover crop that can be put down right away and provides cover for the plants. That way the weeds aren't moving in, and then it's also providing for the soil, breaks down very quickly, and then let's say we're planting broccoli in the fall. So in that short one season, I've gone from lettuce, which is terrible that I can't remember the family that's in. Then it goes to buckwheat, which I know is a Polygonaceae, and then it goes to a Brassica family in the fall. That's bad. I should look up lettuce. I'm going to find out what that family is. So yeah, crop rotation. So diversity is going to be huge. So just having a diverse rotation. So just like I said, in 1 year, hypothetically, I've got that one bed that's had 3 different crops. So this allows you to manage weeds in different ways at different times as well, having that diverse rotation. But then also having crops with different life cycles. So annual weeds, like I just said, are more common in annual crops, and winter annuals in winter wheat. Biennial and perennial weeds and perennial crops such as dandelion in with alfalfa. At the Sage Farm, in our student plot, we have thankfully a lot of perennial rye and perennial clover, and what we're seeing in that is that we have a great deal of mugwort. I shouldn't say a great deal, there's patches of mugwort, but for the most part, that cover crop has done a really good job of suppressing the weeds. Perennial rye has a little bit of an alleliopathic effect, so it doesn't allow weed seeds to germinate quite as well, so that becomes a really good one to introduce in the beginning when you're trying to deal with weeds in a certain area. Again, I think the Nordells did a year of cover crop before they ever planted anything with the objective of killing weeds, and I'm certain that rye was part of that mix because I remember that. So then also you could vary your crop planting date. So planting early might give the crop better chance against weeds that are late emerging weeds. And then just changing the planting date from year to year. And even a slight change might be helpful in keeping the weeds off balance. And then using cover crops we've talked about. And when you start to get into that big wide world of cover crops, what works where, what I like to look at is where I live, and I'm in the Northeast, obviously, Northwest New Jersey. So I would look at a Northeast list of cover crops, and there are certain cover crops that are best for weed suppression. And like I said, you might start out your first season with a lot of cover crops that are good for weed suppression. And if you have the ability to, take a year of just allowing the cover crop to be in place, I would check out what the Nordells did. Because like I said, I'm pretty sure it was a rye. Well, I'm almost positive, really almost positive that it was rye. But I think it could have been a mix, because a lot of times we do a diverse mix of cover crops, like 3 cover crops together. And they just left it there for the entire year while they planned. So basically they had a planning year. So I feel really fortunate that the Food Shed Alliance planted those crops, those cover crops on our plot before we were able to secure that plot. And right now we're basically, reaping the benefits for multiple years because it is a perennial. Next spring, we're going to till it in and start fresh with a new plan, but it's been really actually fortunate that we've been able to allow that cover crop to remain in place. So, next type of management strategy is mechanical. And as an organic grower, this is going to be your number one means of, as an organic grower, your number one means would probably be prevention and cultural, right? But this is going to be number 2, because we don't find a lot of biological controls out there And if you're an organic grower, there are very few herbicides that you can use. And they're not very effective, and they're exceptionally expensive. So mechanical becomes huge. So we'll spend some time on this. So this is the point where I would say to my students, tell me, what are some types of mechanical strategies that you could use when dealing with weeds? So just take a minute and think about that. What are some of the mechanical controls that you would use? And you can think of. And I'll start listening. Listening? I'm listening. I'll start listing what I have. Okay. So that's what I have on my list. So we've got tillage. Obviously that's a big one for farmers. Mowing could actually be a big one. I feel like I've probably employed that one the most in my life. Well, no, I take that back. Cutting, hoeing, and hand removal. Those are the two I've employed the most in my life. Hoeing and hand removal. And then also physical barriers. So we're going to get into each one of these. And along with physical barriers is the act of solarization. And then last but absolutely not least is flaming. So if you're a small grower, these are practical. If you're a large grower, these are not practical. And I take that back. If you're a small grower, those are practical. If you're a large grower with a lot of free labor, those are still practical. But I don't know too many people that are offering free labor these days. And although there are some, because I mean, in some cases, and this is no lie, people need to get back on the land and have these experiences, and there's a lot of satisfaction in weeding, gotta say. All right, but as a large grower, you're going to look more at tillage, mowing, physical barriers, solarization, and flaming. These are going to be for your small grower or somebody that's lucky enough to have a lot of volunteers, and that really is a true experience. Or you would use these for those herbicide resistant weeds, because you might just have a couple of patches in your field that have changed over to this herbicide resistant weed. So those are going to be All right, so tillage. And I'm just going to talk through these a little bit more than write, because it takes me forever to write. So with tillage, you're destroying the emerged weeds, obviously, right? You may also be bringing up submerged or buried weed seed. So your primary tillage is, perhaps, for example, moldboard plowing, chiseling, heavy disking, and rototillering. rototilling. And this is going to destroy the annual and biennial weeds. It will disrupt root systems and other vegetative reproductive structures. And in some cases, it could bury the crop residue. But as we've learned, some of our perennial and biennial weeds, and even annual weeds, we've learned that certain weeds will reproduce even more so if they get chopped up. So it's a matter of timing as well when you do tillage. And again, that goes back to this article we'll read about the Nordells, because it's very thought out, it's very intentional as far as when they till. And then your secondary tillage would be to prepare that weed-free seed bed, essentially. You want to prepare a very nice seed bed to plant into. This you might use discs, field cultivators, and harrows. They also have a tool called a perfecta. I just learned about the perfecta, and I'm pretty sure I've seen a perfecta in action, but I just didn't know what it was. But that's basically creates a beautiful seed bed, a slightly raised seed bed. And then your tertiary tillage is after the crop has been planted. So you've got these different stages, so your primaries, you're basically going to destroy what's there, whether it's the weeds or the cover crop or both. Secondary is going to be to prepare that seed bed. And your tertiary is then looking at after the crop has emerged. So this is after emergence, and that is keeping that crop, allowing that crop to continue to compete with the weeds, not letting the weeds become established, essentially. All right. And those, you might use harrows, rotary hoes, row cultivators. They have, what are those things now? Like the finger weeders. There's a few different types of weeders that'll move through your crop and avoid your crop, essentially. And those are going to be really key as your crop is emerging, because it's this idea of not letting the weeds outcompete your crop. And in a lot of cases, your weeds are going to grow much faster. So even though we might put all of our energy and fertilizer and time and love into our crop, the weeds are still going to outcompete, because that's just who they are, and they're able to do that. And that's part of their survival. So these tillage practices, especially the secondary and tertiary, are highly dependent on timing. Being connected, obviously, or maybe not obviously, but timing being connected to the weather and to soil moisture, because in certain cases you want your weeds to dry out quickly and desiccate on top of the earth, or in some cases you might actually want them to, if you're pulling annual weed seeds up, you might want them to germinate so that you can hit them again with the flamer or whatever it might be. Small weeds are obviously very vulnerable, and that's the time to target your weeds. And just like I mentioned, dry weather after the tillage can cause your weeds to die and desiccate, and that's ideal. All right, so then we have mowing, and mowing obviously needs to be timed so that it does not harm the crop. And mowing is just going to suppress weeds. So this is more about weed suppression. And it's, in my opinion, a lot about, I don't know if it's just my opinion, but it is, it's also about just preventing seed. So I have utilized mowing or string trimming at that moment where the seeds are, maybe in their late flowering stage, or the weeds, are in their late flowering stage and they're about to set seed. So in order to prevent them from going to seed, or maybe they're in their early flower stage. So it's like I said, it's more about suppression, or it's that moment where you're like, oh man, I gotta get out there and I gotta do this now. And I don't have time to, get out the hose and dig or use a different type of control or management. Mowing is going to be more effective on broadleaf weeds. So your dicots, it's going to be more effective on dicots versus grasses. We all probably can figure out just by that thought right there that the monocots actually get stimulated by mowing. They get stimulated by grazing. So the mowing is not going to be as effective on your monocots. And then the other option for using mowing, and this is something I have definitely done because of the type of pathway I maintain in certain gardens, is to mow those pathways. The vineyards, the orchards often have some kind of living cover, and if they don't, they should, frankly. But you know, you might mow your or string trim your fence rows, you know, your access paths, your roads, however, to keep them from going to seed. All right, so then physical barriers. So with physical barriers, oh, and then these guys, like I said, these are all going to come into play for the smaller growers, the growers that have lots of volunteer help, and the herbicide-resistant crops, or I'm sorry, herbicide-resistant weeds that show up in your crops. All right, so then physical barriers become a big one, and that is your black plastic sheeting, which I'm not a big fan of, and only because it ends up in the landfill. There's a lot of benefits to black plastic sheeting. It could also be called a plastic mulch. My big opposing piece to the black plastic is the fact that it ends up in the landfill. And but it is excluding the sunlight to the land, so you're preventing those weeds from germinating. It is really a good choice for high value crops. So your tomatoes and your peppers, some of your squashes, and in some cases it works to warm the soil early as well, so it can be beneficial for that reason. So it's good for those hot crops. Again, you know, your cucumbers, tomatoes, you know, the hot crops. It can be used obviously in the landscape and small garden as well. Again, this is going to be more in your market garden as opposed to, you know, the field crops. But in my opinion, again, this is my opinion, I don't think it's very aesthetically pleasing, so I don't like to see it in the landscape or the small garden. I've probably spent, in my experience with black plastic, I've spent 90% of that experience pulling it out versus installing it because I don't like the way it looks. And that goes to be said with those weed barriers as well. At the garden I used to work at, they installed this weed barrier, and I mean they, meaning some folks that helped me there, because I didn't actually do it myself. And it was not even a year later that we were already seeing weeds growing, because the mulch that you put on top of the weed barrier to make the weed barrier attractive then is, you know, a new place for weeds to move in. So it's very short term, depending, and you know, costs money to install, costs money to buy. So the weeds may not grow underground, but they grow on top. So solarization, I'm not sure if I have a section on that. I kind of don't, but this is something we talked a little bit about, and this is the idea of using, I guess one other thing I should say about the black plastic, just one other thing, or two other things. One is they do have a corn gluten, made by corn gluten, of course it's probably GMO corn, but whatever, and it breaks down. So it breaks down in the landfill, or it'll break down on your land over time. Again, I'm not a big fan, because I'm just not a big fan of plastic, period, but at least it's breaking down, right? Well, for some reason we're not allowed to use it if you're organic or USDA organic. Maybe they've changed that, but for some reason there was a period of time, if not continuing on, that we couldn't use the corn gluten, which didn't make any sense. They use it more in Europe. So, okay. The other thing is it's not just black. There are several different colors. So depending on your crop, you might choose a different color. There's red and blue, apparently. They're white. So there's different reasons for different colors. So just wanted to say those two things. It's not just black. It's not the only choice anymore. And so then solarization is using a clear plastic. And I would suggest that old greenhouse plastic is going to be the best. Old because it's it's meant to deal with that UV light in this way, increasing the light. But also I wouldn't use brand new plastic because it's expensive. You could use other plastic though as well. This is effective. This is very effective, and it can be used in the same way that we would use a flamer. Basically, you could prepare the seed bed, irrigate the seed bed slightly, allow a few tiny little seeds to emerge, and then solarize it. On a hot day, you're going to kill all those weed seeds, and you're basically going to create what we call a stale seed bed. Stale being a good thing in this case. Not bread. I didn't say bread, I said bed. Stale seed bed. So the other way you can accomplish that is with the flaming. Just finish this thought, clear plastic. And again, it's all about timing, with the solarization. You probably don't want to let it out there too long. You'll probably end up killing your good beneficial organisms. And, I shared my story where we took the greenhouse plastic off of a greenhouse and left it on the lawn for a little bit too long on a hot day and basically killed the lawn. Actually, I don't think we killed it. I think we just set it back and it looked horrible for several weeks. I think it did actually end up regrowing. But that's not a good thing because it was actually not just this location was a destination nursery. So if you've got a destination nursery, you got a huge patch of dead lawn out in front of your greenhouse. Doesn't look so good. So just a little note to self. All right, so then flaming. This is probably my favorite way to weed control. I got a little flame. Okay. Anyway. Okay. Anyway, it's not burning, and we talked about this at the Sage site. We're not burning. Basically, what you're doing is you are heating up the plant tissue to the extent that you're disrupting the plant cells. So it can be very quick, depending on the size of the weed. And if it's an annual and it's just emerged, very quick. All right. So you're heating the plant tissue. You're not burning it. All right. So this again can be used for those stale seed beds that we just talked about. You first till, then you allow some seed weeds to germinate, or some weed seeds to germinate, and then you flame after that, and then you plant. The other way you can do this, and this is brilliant, and this is something that we'll absolutely be doing when we plant carrots, because carrots and beets as well as many, many other crops, they don't do well with competition, and they take a long time to germinate. So I should look this up to know for sure, but let's just say carrot seeds take 10 days to germinate. So you do this, and you're brilliant, and you've thought this through, and you have created your beautiful bed, you've allowed some weed seeds to germinate, you've flamed, and now you've planted your carrots. So on day 7 or 8, knowing that they're going to germinate on day 10, now there's never you're never going to have, they're germinating on day 10. It's going to be like they germinate from 10 to 14 days. So obviously you want to hit it before they germinate because you're going to kill your crop. But say on day 7, you're out there and you're flaming again on your carrot bed. So now you've just killed all of the weeds that would already have a head start on those carrots. It's brilliant, it's beautiful, it's worth every penny in the propane and every penny in the equipment and every penny in your labor. But yeah, like I said, you're heating the plant, you're not burning it, you're basically creating a thermal shock to the plant. So it's best for annuals. It works really well for annuals. It's usually propane. So there is cost associated with that fuel, obviously cost associated with the equipment, and cost associated with your labor. And I actually have a note in here. So I actually did look this up at one point. This is good. Carrots take 14 to 21 days to germinate. And see, that's another reason why it's good to get out there and flame these carrots. prior to their germination, because they're spending a lot of time in your stale seed bed over the course of 3 weeks. Say they take 21 days to germinate. That weed bed, or I'm sorry, that stale seed bed is not a stale seed bed anymore by then. Beets take 7 to 14 days. So your beets, you'd want to get out there on day 5. Your carrots, you'd probably want to get out there on day 10. But then monitoring your seeds as well. You know, this becomes the part where you as the grower are scouting your fields on a regular basis. Like, let's say every Monday or every Monday and Friday, you're scouting your fields. Lettuces take 2 to 12 days. So your lettuces, you're not going to have much time to do this kind of practice. There's going to be certain seeds that are going to be better at this than others, or you know, better choices than others. All right, so what are the pros and cons? So we've got a list of pros here. So if we implement these prevention, cultural, and mechanical, which I feel like I'm missing something here. I am. Okay, here I am. So I didn't talk about, okay, I talked about black plastic, but what about just natural mulch? You know, there's all kinds of mulches that we can use. Hay, wood chips, straw, you know, obviously some have seeds and some don't. Compost, I mean, that's not the greatest, it's most expensive probably, but it's a possibility. So I forgot to mention that there's these other mulches that you can use, and there's so many benefits to these types of mulches. A friend of mine, an organic grower in Hackettstown or Mount Olive, she grows her own hay. And I actually mentioned to somebody yesterday that I would like us to grow our own hay for mulch, because straw is used for mulch as well, right? But straw is a bit thicker and had a bit more, what do I want to say? I want to say like it's got more lignins. There's probably another word for that. Hay is smaller, so it's thinner, and it breaks down a little bit easier. And I said something to you, a farmer yesterday, and I said, you know, I want us to grow our own hay because I want to have control over it. Here I am talking about not having control. Now I want control over my hay. And she went straight into the chemical inputs of the hay. I wasn't even thinking about that. What I was thinking about was the fact that a lot of times our product that we use as mulch, if it's hay or straw, is coming in with seeds, right? So the plant has been allowed to flower and seed. So what my friend is doing at her farm, School Lunch Farm, is she's harvesting her hay prior to it going to seed. So she's got like the best of both worlds. It's organic, because she's certified organic, but it's also a thinner material that's going to be able to be incorporated into the soil a little bit faster. The organisms are able to break it down a little bit better, and she's not introducing any more seed. So that was my objective, was not necessarily the chemical inputs. Obviously I wouldn't be necessarily putting chemical inputs into it, but the point this other farmer was making is, like, you know, there's chemicals everywhere, and how do we avoid that entirely? And, you know, they drop out of the rain, and I just don't go down that road because I got enough stuff to worry about. All right, so what are the pros to using these types of controls? Let's see. There are no chemicals. Hey, I just talked about that, right? So you're reducing the residue, the chemical residue that might be on the plants or in the soil or in the air and in the water, all right? Other pros, you don't have to worry about drift. When we talk about chemical, when we talk about the pesticide portion of this class, we'll talk about the environmental concerns, also the health concerns of the humans that are spraying, and we don't have to worry about drift, which is a real deal, even in organic farming if you choose to use organic herbicides. You don't have any herbicide carryover. So there's this herbicide carryover that can occur in your soils. That's going to depend on the type of chemical you use and the type of soils you have. In some cases, it's not broken down, and you have a carryover from year to year. You will not be dealing with the herbicide tolerant or herbicide resistant weeds, which are very difficult to control. That's probably why we spend billions of dollars. There's a little bit of a reduced cost in some of these practices, that could be argued, I suppose. You're going to have less, if you go forward with less cultivation, you'd have less erosion. That seems like a little bit of a side note. I'm not sure why I included that exactly. But using these different types of mechanical controls that are successful, and timing, and really thinking intentionally about how you plant your crop is going to reduce your hand weeding. The cons are often there's a higher equipment cost. It's often less expensive to buy the equipment that sprays herbicides. Cons continue is the precise timing that's needed. There's often a lower application speed that occurs. I see what I'm doing here. I'm sorry. This is so bad. I'm so sorry. This is actually the pros and cons of flaming alone. This is why this makes sense now. Okay, the pros and cons of flaming. Sorry. Back up. Pros and cons of flaming: no chemicals, no drift, no herbicide carryover. You don't have to deal with the resistant weeds. Reduced cost compared to the other types of organic controls, like hand hoeing, for instance. There's less cultivating and flaming because you're not tilling each time, so then you have less erosion. And then there's a reduction in your hand weeding for the organic growers. All right, so the cons are the higher equipment costs. So flame weeder that you an implement that you attach to your tractor is going to be way more expensive than the herbicide attachments. Precise timing is imperative for your crop safety. So that's where that precise timing comes in. You don't want to damage your crop, right? There's a lower application speed, and that goes into this idea that you are disrupting the cell of the plant. You're not actually burning it, so you have to move slow enough over the plant that you're allowing the flamer to make that disruption happen. There's a lack of residual weed control. What do I mean by that? Sometimes when you spray certain chemicals, certain herbicides will have a residual effect. So that means they don't just kill the weeds that are there now. Maybe the weeds that try to germinate are not successful because of the residual effect. You don't have that with flaming at all. Propane fuel is potentially cleaner than diesel, but you're using diesel as well, so you're using fuel. You're using propane, you're using fuel, you're using diesel to run the tractor, you're using fuel. So those are going to be your costs that are going to be incurred. Yep. Weed response, crop tolerance, and cost. Okay. So, moving on, we're almost there, is biological controls. So I asked the class the other day at some point about biological controls. Do we have any biological controls for weeds? So, the idea of a biological control, just like with our insects, is an organism that consumes the other organism, right? So, there are a few biological controls out there that are seriously effective, and I am not familiar with many of them. But there are definitely some biological controls that have been introduced to control weeds, and they have been successful. The one that I like to remind everybody of, and somebody got this, is goats. So yeah, that's a real thing. People are renting herds of goats to farmers to control certain weeds. They eat, I think everything. Like they even eat poison ivy. I don't know if they eat English ivy, but they definitely, maybe they do. But at any rate, goats are actually a logical, likely, and possible management control strategy, X that word, control, strategy for weeds. There are some, like I said, there are some biological controls out there. I'm not even going to get into them because a lot of times the biological controls are introduced for the sake of invasive weeds. So that's just something to keep in mind. So then the other piece of this is the chemical, and we will get into the chemical portion of this class at the end. I think it's going to be a fine topic to cover, primarily remote. There's not much we do in the lab for that, but and I've already talked to you about the idea of getting your license, your pesticide applicator license. It's a good idea. It's not something that we cover in this class exactly. We'll talk about the different licenses that are available. I'm going to provide everybody with this document, or part of this document, because it gets very deep into the herbicides, and we're not going to go that far in. But I just want to provide this with students on spraying. So we'll take a look closer at the other parts of IWM when we get to that portion of the class, when we look at the pesticide portion. And the reason we get into it a little bit more at that point is because we'll talk about scouting your fields, how to do that, and then how and when to make a decision to spray. So when we're looking at IWM, chemical is the last thing we want to do, and we want to make that choice with a lot of intention, so that we're economically sensible about spraying, because herbicides are not cheap either. But there is this, what we call an economic threshold. So I talk about this with the IPM, and you know, technically IWM is IPM, it just falls under it. I think they even have IDM now, Integrated Disease Management, again, falls under it. So all of these things are pests. All these things are pests. All the chemicals are pesticides. I had a fun little argument with somebody who wanted to argue that herbicide was not a pesticide. And it's like, how is an herbicide not a pesticide when a weed is a pest? It is. So when you look at that big category, there's a lot of things that fall under it, right? We have ways of delineating out what does what to who. But with an IPM plan, with an IW plan, with an ID plan, with all these plans, you have to have a threshold. If you don't have a threshold, you don't have a plan, because the threshold says, now it's time to do something. Your threshold could be one plant in your field, and that's your time to do something. In a public garden, it might be one plant in certain areas of the public garden, because if you're walking into a public garden and you've got weeds in the front, people might turn around and leave. If they're true gardeners, if they're there to look at gardening plants and they see that you're overrun by weeds before they even get in the door, so you might have a threshold of one in certain areas of your landscape or of your garden. In your fields, you may have a completely different threshold. And in some cases it's an economic threshold, in some cases it's an aesthetic threshold. But just like the example of the botanic garden or the public garden, that you might look at that as an aesthetic threshold, but if you're charging $7 a pop for people to come into the garden, it's actually an economic threshold. Because if somebody's turning around and leaving because they don't want to come and see your garden that's full of weeds because you got them in the front, you're not going to make money off those folks, right? They're not going to come in, they're not going to buy stuff in the thrift store or whatever you call it. What is that store? Gift shop or whatever, okay? So we'll talk more about that. And there's a ton of computer models out there now for farmers to help them with determining when to spray. Yeah, they're actually brilliant. These computer models are quite brilliant. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. Sometimes, though, taking the guesswork out of it by a computer is causing the farmer to be a little bit relaxed on their role to play, which is the most important role to play. So no matter what computer application you get or what app you get on your phone, make sure that this part is still working, because there could be a day that we don't have computers and we don't have phones, we don't have apps, but your brain is still going to be in your head. And so let's make sure that this is the most important thing as far as understanding how this all works. So we'll talk about field scouting. Obviously that's an important thing. And like I said, this is all in this document that I want to share. It does go into non-chemical weed control, and we talk about seed banks, because seed banks are huge. Biological, cultural, mechanical, propane-fueled flame weeding, the response to weed, so weed response to flame weeding. So there's some challenges there, because perennial weeds can have a response that we don't want. And then this also goes into the cost of these different practices, which is huge. You know, farmers have to consider their costs. And then it gets into weed management and conservation tillage. So we're talking more about conservation tillage in the soils class as we move along. And in some cases, the no-till is going to be a different type of way of weed management. Ridge till and ecological farming may have completely different approaches. And then we'll talk about these resistant crops as well. I'm sorry, I keep saying that. Resistant weeds and ways to minimize resistant weeds. I have to say though, I mean, I'm in my class right now, none of my students want to spray. I think that, and I don't mean no spray, no nothing, but I think that the students, from what I've experienced so far, are very open-minded to alternative practices, so that they can, you know, maintain their own health and the health of their farm, the health of their land, the health of their animals, and the water, and so on and so forth. So I'm happy that that's the case. I also feel like with that kind of mindset, we'll come up with new and better ways to manage our farms and gardens. And I think that, you know, of the herbicides available to organic farmers, they're not very effective, and they are really expensive. So it does not become a practical, unfortunately it's not practical. I will say that the chemical I've used the most in my organic gardening career has been acetic acid, which is vinegar. You go to the store, you buy 5% vinegar or 5% acetic acid, and your household vinegar might be 3 to 5 even. It's not going to kill a lot. It will over time, absolutely. It will kill, especially in multiple applications, it will absolutely kill things. And certain plants are going to be more susceptible. But if you buy a horticultural grade acetic acid, you can get up to 40%. Might even be able to get more and then dilute that mixture. But I've used 35 and 40% acetic acid. That'll burn your face off. You absolutely have to use all safety practices as if you were using any other chemical. Drift is still a major concern with acetic acid. So there's things to take into consideration even if you are using what we call organic chemicals. Because your safety is probably the most important, in my opinion. I absolutely am a dirt lover and tree hugger, but I care about you, and you are the most important organism in that garden or farm, and your family is the most important. So doing things to make sure that everybody's safe is very important. So that concludes what I have today. That was a good, long, lengthy, whatever. Hope you enjoyed it. And if you're in my class, which most probably only the people watching this are in my class, we will continue on with this conversation on Tuesday. I think I'm going to assign the Nordell reading. Like I mentioned, it's called Weed the Soil, Not the Crop, by Ann and Eric Nordell. As I want to do like a little exercise with this on Thursday, and then next week we'll do the weed review. And with that weed review, I'll try to bring in, like I said, I was going to bring in today a lot of different weeds that are on our list. I'll try to bring in those weeds. All right.